Hello, and welcome to Georgia Tech's live panel discussion, Creating a Cybersecurity Culture in an Organization. I'm Rolanda Powell, Marketing Manager for Georgia Tech's Professional Education Cybersecurity Certificate Program, and I will be moderating today's event with Melinda Cotta, the Marketing Manager for Georgia Tech's Online Master's Cyber Degree Program. Together, we will facilitate a 25-minute panel discussion and take 5 to 10 minutes to answer questions from the audience at the end. Please be sure to include your questions in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen.
Thank you, Rolanda, and welcome everyone. It is a great pleasure to introduce our panelists today, starting with Dr. Rahim Beyer, who is the VP of Research for Georgia Tech School of Electrical and Computer Engineering. A yellow jacket himself, he is the Executive Director of our OMS Cybersecurity Program, and you may have even taken a class with him. Dr. Beyer devotes a significant amount of his time to volunteer service, including co-founding the Academic and Research Leadership Network, serving as the Director of Georgia Tech's Summer Undergraduate Research in Engineering and Science program, and the Faculty Advisor for Georgia Tech's Lewis Stokes Alliances for Minority Participation.
Our next panelist is Renita Folds, who spent over 15 years managing and supporting research and education programs within Georgia Tech Research Institute. She focuses much of her time in expanding the cybersecurity professionals' education courses, leading their development and delivery for both Department of Defense and Industry. In her spare time, Renita likes to sing and blow bubbles with her grandson. She frequently visits home at the farm to keep her grounded and connected to family.
Our next guest is Anand Jimmy Loomis, who is Georgia Tech's Chief Information Security Officer. Jimmy leads the cybersecurity operations at Georgia Tech, engineering, security policy, and regulatory compliance teams who are responsible for incident prevention, incident detection and response, as well as policy and regulatory compliance. You may recognize Jamie as a faculty member for the OMS Cybersecurity Program and a proud yellow jacket.
Last but not least, we'd like to welcome Shelby Allen to the panel. Shelby has over 12 years of computer science experience in a variety of industries, including systems, high-frequency trading, and cybersecurity, where he focuses on dynamic and static analysis for exploitation, code and binary transformations for optimization. You may recognize him as an instructor for our cybersecurity certificate program or from DragonCon, where he spoke about his research in creating tools for software analysis. Shelby is a fan of origami, loud music, and skateboarding. Welcome everyone.
Thank you.
We'll start with the first question, which goes to our Chief Information Security Officer, Jimmy. So creating a cybersecurity culture in an organization is a long-standing struggle for CTOs and CISOs, such as yourself. How have you seen organization security cultures change over the years, and what do you see as the main challenges today?
Well, thank you, and I just want to say thanks for having me on today. I appreciate the opportunity. So as far as culture goes, it's definitely been shifting, but I think first I would probably want to say that, any cybersecurity program needs to have probably three things, right? So people, process, and technology. And I think something that definitely gets a lot of attention is the technology aspects of cybersecurity. But perhaps the most important thing is the people aspect of cybersecurity. And oftentimes people also just misconstrue having people, process, and technology to mean you need cybersecurity professionals as people. But while that's true, I think perhaps more importantly is the people, the holistic people of any organization, and ensuring that they know what their responsibilities are with respect to cybersecurity. And I think that's where culture comes into play. So I've been in this industry for 16 years, and I have definitely witnessed the culture in organizations shift over those years. Years ago when I started, what was most important to people was probably just compliance, right? So there were laws they had to comply with. Not many people really had an appreciation for dealing with cybersecurity challenges and what that meant to their organization and just how impactful data breaches and cyber attacks could be. And also, we're not heavily focused on ensuring that the people in their organization had a security mindset and that they had a security culture that ensured that everyone understood their responsibilities around security and the need for them personally to protect information assets. And honestly, having been in this industry for a while, I can say that the people aspects definitely outweigh the technology aspects. Cybersecurity professionals can do a lot to try and secure an organization, but they will always be outpaced by the many people in an organization that do things every day, right? And so, if the culture and the organization doesn't understand their responsibility, bad things will just always continue to happen. So how has it changed? Well, so there was a recent Gartner survey. They surveyed CEOs across the country, and 61% of respondents stated that they were increasing their digital business spending due to cyber threats, right? So that's fairly staggering. So more than half of the CEOs surveyed said that they're increasing spend directly related to security. So that's good. That means that the culture at the top is starting to shift, that they're starting to understand the need to invest in security. But it's also not just about making sure that your executives are in tune and understanding what's happening in the world. How does that get driven down into the organization? And that's really where I still see the challenges today, right? So, organizations where it's very obvious that there needs to be a culture of security, people at the, at every level of the organization definitely get it, right? So obvious examples of that are like the military, right? Or organizations like the CIA or in the NSA, places like that, or even in banking and finance. They get at every level that you need that level of assurance, and everyone has a job to do and a part to play. But broadly outside of those spaces, I still see it as being a challenge that people don't understand that they have a responsibility and that they have a job to do related to security, and they need to think through that lens. And but the other piece that I'm still seeing that really is, in my opinion, how you drive culture is by holding people to account for that, right? So how are people being measured against their security performance, right? I mean, my job may have nothing to do particularly with security, and I'm just like, for example, maybe I'm, let's just say, take Georgia Tech as an example. I might be an adjunct faculty member. Why do I need to have security on my mind every day? But the reality is I handle, data every single day, and perhaps more closely tied to systems and system security, IT professionals, right? Are they being given, performance metrics that they need to uphold that include security goals, right? And so all of that is really, I think, what's necessary in order to drive security and security culture, and to really sort of shift the needle so people aren't just relying on the next greatest security tool to try and secure their environment. And so that's really sort of the main challenge that I'm seeing today. And I'll pause there.
Well, it'll definitely be a shift to include in the performance plan. We'll move to question 2 for Shelby if anyone else doesn't have anything else to add to that. Shelby, earlier this year, companies had to quickly make the shift to work from home due to COVID-19. From a researcher's point of view, what vulnerabilities or exploitations do you see on the rise in this global pandemic?
That's an excellent question, and I think it's interesting that there has been so much that has changed in the past year that it's almost hard to, I don't know, I almost feel like I could make up a couple of answers and no one really knows what's going on, and so they probably just nod along to it. But I took some time to try and figure out exactly how I would, group these into a couple of trends, and I tried to come up with 3 good discussion points. And one of them, I guess the first would be phishing attacks. I think phishing attacks, and for anyone not familiar, these are it's a type of social engineering where you're trying to get someone to click on something that looks legitimate in which it's not. Often these prey on things such as curiosity or fear or threats. And so these are often trying to get low-hanging fruit of people who may not be paying as much attention to what they're clicking. And so we have definitely seen a huge uptick in things like that because this is an attack of opportunity, right? You're looking for the low-hanging fruit. And so now that there's just kind of this new global mindset, that there's just this new stressful situation that's happening for everyone, and there's a lot of uncertainty and more people than usual, it's, from the perspective of an attacker, it's kind of this key situation to try and convince someone to, click this to defend yourself, or here's this news article that shows you what you really should be doing right now. Those are, all the more convinced when someone's usual frame of mind has been threatened, and which is, perhaps a fair way to describe what's been going on. Secondly, there's just been an increase. There's a couple of reports on just more unique attacks that have come out in the past 6 to 8 months. And it's funny that from my perspective, I was trying to think about why is that? Like these are, these have nothing to do with just, a phishing attack, whatever excuse it uses is still a phishing attack. But why are we just seeing, more unique malware coming out right now? And were you to ask me why, I think it's because there's a lot of people at home right now, including those who make malware, with a lot of free time on their hands. I think right now, just the opportunities that people have to, take up that carpentry hobby of theirs, or make a little extra money working on malware. This is a time where everybody's, figuring out how to be productive at home, and I think that includes those who are working on the darker side of this industry. And then third of all, I think it's the one that we all feel is just general exhaustion, especially in IT staff. Just one of the this is not so much of a change as to what the exploitations and vulnerabilities are, but just every department, every person's individual capacity. Because like Jimmy said, there's process and people that are a part of this as well. The technology will keep running, but we need to keep it updated. We need to keep it deployed. We need to keep everyone educated. We need to keep everyone vigilant. And right now, there is just such, on average, just lower energy, lower ability to kind of move agilely to these sorts of things. So those are kind of my three main thoughts on this.
Do you mind if I jump in and add a little to what was?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that there's also the whole shift in the work location aspect of things that is causing consternation as well. So I agree with everything that you just said, but I also think there's a greater attack surface because everyone started working from home. And so any organization that was following a very traditional perimeter defense sort of, methodology for securing their organization, when people took their machines home, they just lost all those perimeter controls. And if they weren't prepared and had a different paradigm for how they were offering security, they were going to find themselves in a bad situation.
Right. That's an excellent point. And since there's been kind of this urgency to continue work, those steps to try and keep that attack surface from growing too quickly and too insecurely have probably been, played second or third fiddle to the just getting everyone working successfully from home and productivity. And often that comes with the sacrifice of security. It's an excellent point.
Thank you, Shelby and Jimmy. If we can move on to the next question, but before that, for our guests, we have a little poll going on to the right side of your screen. Our question for today is, which is the biggest barrier to creating an effective cybersecurity culture? So please have your votes, and we will share them with everyone at the end of the panel. Thank you. So, the next question goes to our OMS Cybersecurity Program Director, Dr. Rahim Baya. In every connected world, it's difficult to predict when and how security breach can happen. Many organizations have mechanisms to for incident detection and response. But in your experience, what are the key factors in building a successful incident response team?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Melina, for the great question. I'll start out by just mentioning my titles just to make sure it's clear. So I'm actually a professor in the School of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and also as a separate job, I'm one of the vice presidents for research for the institute. So it's not just for the unit. I represent all the institute. I love all the units equally. So your question, I think that's a really good point. And when you think about, I'll take a step back and think about leadership in general, and when you, and no matter what the goal, sort of the operational goal is, you want to make sure that you are very thoughtful how you build your team, right? So you want to build a team ideally, and this is even, when starting a company, you want to make sure that team has the folks with the right technical expertise. But I think one of the more important things to keep in mind is make sure that these individuals compensate for your weaknesses, right? So the worst thing you can do, first of all, is be a leader and think you don't have weaknesses. That's so, I recently led an initiative at Georgia Tech. And, when I was asked to do that, the first thing I could think of, well, what are some areas that I need strength? I need more support, right? So I'm a professor. I have sort of very deep understanding of cybersecurity, and I build new tools and algorithms in the area of cyber physical system security. And I'm also very used to leading large teams, large units, right? So those are strengths. But I'm not an operational person. I'm not a day-to-day operational person. So when I decided to build the team, I said, well, let me get some folks that compensate, for my weaknesses, right? So I asked Jimmy, for example, Jimmy Loomis here, our CISO, hey, very deep technical expertise, especially operational. I want you to join this team. And I also asked Didier Contis, who is one of the directors, well, actually director of IT for the College of Engineering. Again, very deep expertise in IT and security. So I wanted a very small, agile team. And again, the goal was to find folks that had skills that complemented mine, and they were the right folks. And also, in addition to having the skills that complemented mine, I wanted to make sure that the team was right. At least the small agile team was right for the organization, right? So at Georgia Tech, our IT is sort of in two different categories. It's sort of the central IT, and then also we have IT in the units. And again, having Jimmy there representing central IT, the central organization, and then having Didier representing the IT for the different units, it allows us to make sure that we can make decisions, as we make decisions, that we would incorporate all of the organization. From there, we were able to have a bunch of different sort of ad hoc cross-functional teams to go after a specific task, right? So it's important to make sure, number one, that when you respond to incidents, number one, you remember that you are a leader. And once you do that, you acknowledge areas in which they can be improved, and you want to build your teams to compensate for those, and also make sure that the teams are comprehensive and that represents the entire organization. I want to just talk a little bit about, Jimmy mentioned people, processes, and technology, and that's the approach that we took. We're very clear that we needed to address all of those. And when you put in new technology, you're going to change processes, and you're going to have change management to sort of bring the people along with you. And nobody likes to change. I was complaining the other day about a new video conferencing platform. I'm like, man, I've done 5 of these for the last 6 months. Why do I need this 6th thing? Why do I have to do that, right? So nobody wants to change, so we got to make sure we bring them along. And Jimmy had a really good point earlier. It's always people. People are always our weakest link, right? So even with buggy code, it's because people write bad code, right? I mean, it's always the weakest link. Shelby mentioned about exhaustion. Exhaustion actually does come into play when you think about clicking on. You build up this resistance, even if you're really good and very thoughtful when you read your emails. When you're at 7 p.m. at night, you've been working for 12 hours and you're exhausted, it's much more likely that you'll click on that link. It's much more likely that you'll do less due diligence, right? So all that stuff comes into play. And I'll pause there for any additional comments from my colleagues.
I think you made a good point about, and it's something that I think in the technology circles that is a problem. Is kind of, I think I often make the assumptions that most of my not necessarily peers, but people in other work environments know as much as we know about security. And so, I mean, we have opinions, but also sometimes don't want to speak out. And so I think there is definitely and even Jimmy mentioned accountability as well. I definitely think that there is an angle here where we need to take more accountability and be more heard.
So I'll double down on that too. So, based on what Raheem was, just talking about and the effort that we went through, one of the key efforts that was made was an effort to push out data security training to 100% of the employees at Georgia Tech. Right? That's a big deal. That's the institute stating that they are very interested in that. And that's a key component of shifting culture. You have to tell people what you expect them to do, right? Tell them how to behave. And so it can't just be the stick. I mean, obviously, people's performance should be evaluated based on, through security as one lens, not the only lens, but as a lens. But, you can't just tell them to do that without actually giving them the tools to be successful.
Yeah, and you've got to have support. That's a really good point, right? And you have to have support from the C-suite, the ELT, right? This is not something that the chief security officer can do on his or her own. You have to have absolute support from the top that this is a high priority. And if you have that, then you can actually, all the other things can actually fall in place. But it starts by the chief executive, right? The president, the CEO, appreciating the importance of security and understanding that, yes, you may have to do things like training or do things that are you may not think are immediate to the bottom line, but it's absolutely critical for the integrity of the organization to do that.
It's great that you mentioned that piece, and it's kind of related to the poll that's going on right now. And I'm not sure if it's more appropriate for a later Q&A session, but I'm huge on the soapbox of where policy comes into play here, that being able to enforce that accountability is something that needs to be taken higher and higher. I know one of the questions mentions GDPR in the EU. I think that this is one of those industries where the effects, everyone knows that they are there, and yet kind of like the tragedy of the commons, it's easy to dismiss them or not take accountability for when companies do have effects on their customers or on their employees. And so I definitely think that, not exactly pertinent to this question, but just for the success of cybersecurity, that there probably needs to be, a more regulation.
Well, we'll move on to question 3. Thank you for sharing about training needs, but let's continue on and talk more about employee training. Renita, employee training is one of the most important elements in creating a cyber savvy culture. As a senior research associate, you act as a liaison between industry partners, learners at Georgia Tech, learners and Georgia Tech researchers and instructors to ensure the training we offer is timely and relevant to the market needs. What do you see currently as the most pressing training need?
Thank you, Rolanda. So I think we've really moved past that point of cybersecurity awareness. So as our attackers create these more sophisticated threats that we've already talked about, playing on the global pandemic and those more sophisticated phishing campaigns, then we have to be able to recognize those threats and figure out how to combat them. Phishing campaigns, malware, ransomware, all of these are more advanced than ever before, so that makes them harder to detect. And the malicious actors are using AI to create these very sophisticated threats. So therefore, we have to train our employees on how to identify these threats and what to do once they have. A recent report that I read stated that 90% of data breaches are caused by human error. So here we're back to the people in that we've mentioned throughout the panel today. And that really makes sense to me, because on a large scale, then in general, the people are easier to compromise and exploit than finding that software vulnerability. And then threats come from various places. And so it's more than just those phishing campaigns, but social engineering is still a very real threat and to people at all levels in the organization. And so we have to be diligent at home more than ever now that such a large percentage of the workforce is now working from home. And we've already talked about how that has increased our attack surface, right? So we have to be diligent at home as well as at work, and particularly on our social media platforms as well. So to me, it's encouraging to see organizations trending toward creating this culture in which cybersecurity is taken seriously. So I was interested in the poll that we have, because it is showing that people are saying that it's still a challenge for leadership to take the cybersecurity seriously enough. So perhaps the organizations that I deal with are those that are on the other side of that and see what a serious problem it is and how important it is to create this culture. We've been working with a large international company over the last 4 years, creating and delivering cybersecurity courses for their cyber and IT teams. In the past, we've created classes around penetration testing and defensive cyber operations, creating a secure operations center. But this last year, they reached out to us to create a new course, and it's security-focused systems administration. So we realized it's not just the responsibility of the IT team or your cyber team. It's really the responsibility of everyone in the organization to maintain that cyber secure environment. Again, the bottom line is humans are still the weakest link in cybersecurity. So we have to have that consistent training on how to recognize those threats and what to do about it. So as attackers step up their game, then we have to do the same thing on the training side. I read somewhere recently that what we're trying to do is to create this human firewall, and I liked that term because I think that pretty much sums it up.
Thank you, Renita. Before we move on to questions from the audience, we wanted to share the poll results. So the question was, which is the biggest barrier to creating an effective cybersecurity culture? Overwhelmingly, just like with 32%, leadership and employee buy-in. So leadership buy-in is very important here, and employee buy-in is just being ranked at the same level as well. So it all comes back to the people, you're right.
Yeah, and so so the leadership piece totally makes sense. Rarely do you find board of directors rather, that have cybersecurity expertise, or even just digital directors, right? So if you're talking about a company, if you look at their board, right, and that'll give you an idea of how serious or how important cybersecurity is going to be. So you really need to have somebody that's at the board level, because if you think about cybersecurity, it's yet another risk that the board and the C-suite, the ELT have to consider, and it needs to be just deeply ingrained at that level with every other risk associated with it. But right now, in most companies, you don't have digital directors in general, but especially directors that have deep cybersecurity expertise.
I'll jump in with the employee buy-in piece. So I think that one of the things that we have to make sure that we do is that we don't reprimand our employees when they click on a phishing email, right? So we have to make them really feel like that they're part of the solution. And so if they click on some of these phishing campaigns and things like that, then we want them to feel like they can immediately go to their IT team or whatever the procedure is and say, hey, I think I messed up, without feeling like they're going to get in trouble for doing that. So I think that's critical, is to make them feel like that they're part of the solution.
I'll piggyback off of that, Renita. It's when establishing a culture like this, of course, the place that I've seen this best applied was at a security company. But there really were some kind of interesting, both positive and negative practices as far as having employees feel involved. One such example was that, one or two levels up, basically any computer on the floor, if someone saw it unlocked, then it was not just considered okay, but it was considered actively encouraged to do something to mess with someone else's computer. And there was kind of the standing rule that there would be no repercussions, and that person, whoever's computer it was, absolutely deserved whatever happened to them. And perhaps this may be motivation for for pranks and such, but it was in that environment a way and such that we all felt invested, and there was discussion about the most creative ways or the most subtle ways to mess with someone's machine, or if you only had 60 seconds, what could you do with someone's machine? And I on one or two embarrassing occasions, I would return back to my machine and realize it was unlocked, and then I would quickly go through what the top 2 or 3 ways that my machine would likely be messed with. One time I came back and my display is just sideways, everything's sideways. And then other terminal commands have been mapped to other things, and so I can have to spend a half hour and figure out exactly where it all went. But it did create a culture where completely the idea of being invested in security was saturated. And so finding it was a great comment. Yeah, the gamification of cybersecurity, finding ways to motivate at every level, and ideally you'd be able to find it in positive ways as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to see if I can tee up something for Jimmy. I believe there was one organization that recently tied cybersecurity to compensation, and I think you might have mentioned that to me. Can you talk on that, Jimmy, if you're still around?
So I don't think that was me that mentioned it to you, but I think it's a fantastic idea, right? So when I say setting performance evaluation goals too, I think we should also set compensation goals and targets for people, bonuses, things like that for, doing well, right? Going above and beyond, or, those sorts of things. There was an interesting question in here in the event chat. If you had $10 to invest as a CISO or cyber leader to affect security culture of the org, how would you allocate those funds? 100%, I would make it a bonus. I'd take those $10 and say, for the person that doesn't fall for phishing all year or whatever, right? However you want to structure that, here's your bonus. And I think that's what would sort of help motivate people and start shifting that cultural mindset, right? Set that as a goal, help people want to achieve it.
Yeah, I mean, externally, a lot of software companies have bug finder programs. It would be great to have an internal initiative like that as well, where if you're able to, point to some systemic process or find a vulnerability and be able to, articulate it in some way, then that should be rewarded. So yeah.
Thank you guys for sharing how we can take the stigma of cybersecurity within the culture and sharing some fun ways of making it a fun practice within the organization. So we'll switch gears a little bit, and now it's time for questions from the audience. And we do apologize if we don't get the chance to get all of them. But first question that I have is, what would be the best approach when trying to emphasize the cybersecurity culture when social engineering test is perceived as an exercise mistrust?
An exercise of mistrust is what you said? Yeah, but it always works.
I don't know that I agree that it's an exercise in mistrust. We actually have data to support that it's quite effective. I
Right.
think, the downside to doing phishing testing and phishing training in that manner is that, people get their feelings hurt, right? Nobody wants to be seen as having failed at something. And I think sort of there's two ways to look at those testing. So I have witnessed organizations that do phishing, training by doing proactive phishing of their organization, and they are punitive about the results of that. Meaning, if you fall for the phishing exercise, then there is some punishment that is done on you, maybe whatever that is. And then there are other organizations that just take it as a teaching opportunity, right? So they're provided with immediate feedback on how they could have known that that was a phishing message, and given some general security training on the spot. And the results that we've seen based on what we do is that, it definitely drives awareness up, and it drives response rates down, right? It's never going to hit zero. There's no such thing as perfect security, but it keeps people on their toes. And that is part of the key in keeping your culture alive and well, right? If I do training one time, people will be vigilant for the next 4 or 5 days, and then they'll get caught up in their day and their usual routines, and then they'll slowly let their guards down, and then bad things happen, right? So the reason that we do these sorts of things frequently is to make sure that people sort of keep it top of mind. And for us, I have seen it as quite effective.
Yeah,
I mean, that's an excellent. Sorry, go ahead.
if you just think about it as, people again they're really just one component in this whole security ecosystem. And, we write code, and Shelby has expertise and once we write code, we do static and dynamic analysis. We test to see if we wrote code well in a secure way. When we put various systems on our network, we will do network scans, port scans, et cetera, to make sure these systems are secure. So I think it certainly makes sense that if we train individuals, that we test, just like we do, we test with the systems to test to make sure that people receive the training properly. And I think the key is what Jimmy mentioned, is to not stigmatize it, right? Just say, we have all been hacked or will be. Like, if you don't know that, if you think you've not been hacked, that's probably not true. You probably haven't, just don't know it. But we all have been hacked or will be, right? So it shouldn't be a stigma associated with falling for one of the phishing tests at all. But it's something that's absolutely critical.
Yeah,
I'll just anybody that comes to me and says, I'll never fall for phishing, I'm a security expert, give me 5 minutes, I'll craft a phishing message that will get you, I promise.
Yep.
Yeah. And I would be in a bad way if I got my feelings hurt every time I found a bug in my own code. We definitely need to change the kind of the psychology around both of these things, is that we need that growth mindset. And the only way you do that is with, like Raheem said, just continuous testing, using those for opportunities to improve it, and iterating on that.
Okay, great. So I have another question. Are there any rumblings or national regulations being drafted that address data privacy, similar to the GDPR in the EU? Also, what tools, solutions, resources can be recommended to stay apprised of the myriad of different regulations or lack thereof?
There's a couple of loaded questions in there. You can spend a lot of time on both of those, but I've already gone on record, and so I'll start it there in saying that, I think definitely with corporate organizations, there is a propensity to try and not always capture and account for the possible risks of those corporations. And so we definitely need to have something on a regulatory scale for making sure that corporations, and I think that's going to be what initiates this being handled at the C-suite level, which, like Jimmy mentioned. only when corporations are forced to enumerate and account for the possible risks that they have on people's information and general livelihood. We have regulations in place for life safety, and so I think there's definitely a degradation of the quality of life that happens whenever these hacks occur. We're all now just almost desensitized to them when they occur. Get an email and say your information may have been taken by yet another organization. It's like, well, what can I do about it now? Yeah. That'll be. Oh, and I meant to add that the question asked kind of like, are we seeing things like that? Sadly, no. We're seeing quite the opposite. There are, current conversations are whether or not to nationally regulate there to be the installation of backdoors on encryption. And now, arguably, that you can argue for that with good intentions. But as a security professional, I think that's inherently a flawed argument. But that's kind of the push we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think that's where you got to be very careful with. So I'll answer the first question. One is, so you got the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, that is, sort of the California version of GDPR. But I think regulation, you got to be very careful because it can create significant unintended consequences. And I think the example that you just gave is one where you have to be really cautious with regulating back doors and try to encourage that, because you can have these very sort of asymmetric, even more asymmetric opportunities for attackers, right? So my concern with regulation is it may not be as thought through as needed, and may not truly engage cybersecurity professionals to be able to help craft such a thing. And when you don't do that, if it's sort of a knee-jerk reaction to something, and you come with regulation, it's going to cause so many problems that weren't anticipated.
I'll double down on that as well. My primary concern with regulation is that it's created by politicians. 9 times out of 10. Now, typically, any good politician is going to consult with experts, hopefully, and try and build a better law. But once politics starts, weighing in, and trades happen back and forth on what makes sense, and you end up with something that is always less than ideal. And I think the other issue that we run into is just over-regulation. Not to say that we shouldn't have regulation. I'm a believer that we need some regulation, but what I'm coming from is just the myriad of regulations that we now have to comply with that make it extremely challenging to, anytime there is an issue or you need to, work through just what do I have to do to be compliant, that's a major undertaking, right? And so, for example, at Georgia Tech, we have to comply with FERPA, we have to comply with HIPAA, we have to comply with the GLBA, we have to comply with GDPR. We have to comply with, DFARS requirements in our research environments, right? Like this, and the list goes on. And so it becomes quite complicated. And so I would suggest that, anytime that we can sort of reduce the overall amount of regulation and come to an agreement on some standards to make life simpler for organizations to get into compliance, the better off we will all be. So my concern is just the fracturing of all of the regulations. But I do think there's a baseline, right? So sometimes organizations need to be compelled to do the minimum. That is definitely worth having.
I think we have time for at least 1 or 2 more questions. So if you have questions, please be sure to include your questions on Q&A on the right side of your screen. So one last question. I'll let Melina take that over.
I think we have the question about what is your favorite cybersecurity research project happening at Georgia Tech right now?
Well, hey, I actually know who asked this. Hey, Joel, I'll give you a quick shout out. A great guy and has helped drive a lot of research in my particular part of GTRI. I don't know if you're curious of what I'm working on. You could just call me. But I'm There's a lot of great stuff going on. As we mentioned at the beginning, where I'm doing research is in, dynamic and static analysis. Some of the stuff I'm interested in right now actually speaks to some of this conversation about trying to move security not just away, kind of not away from the technology, but, start to saturate more of the people in the process. A lot of our work on exploitation or finding vulnerabilities often comes late in the product cycle. Basically, there is something, it's running, it's been around for a couple of years, and we notice that there may be some problems. Can we figure out where those problems are and maybe fix them? It's a lot cheaper and a lot more effective to prevent problems with both devices and software than it is to alleviate these later. And some of the projects that I'm getting to propose on and hopefully work on in the future are things that are we see agencies kind of pushing for correct by construction ways of kind of taking sometimes the ill-formed, ill-fit requirements or just incomplete requirements for what something should do, and then being able to infer what other requirements are needed so that when it is made, it has less of a vulnerable attack surface. It's certainly a challenging problem, and it takes into account that these requirements are made by people. And again, it comes back to people are usually part of the problem. But it is an interesting one, being able to kind of use technology to maybe guide someone to making better decisions when they're working on a specification or building a new software project. So that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah,
Well,
and I'll give a quick. Oh, I'm sorry, Renee, go ahead.
Well, mine will be short and sweet because I think it surrounds a lot of the work that we do for the DoD, so I can't really go into great detail about that. But it is exciting to see us helping make progress on things with our DoD partners, especially when we're talking about the cyber risk and vulnerabilities on some of our legacy systems. And so making strides on that, I think, is probably one of the greatest projects that I feel like that I'm part of at GTRI.
I'll since we giving shouts out, I'll give a shout out to my students. So the stuff I'm excited about is all the work that my students are working on, and they fall into two categories. One is industrial security, so trying to keep the lights on and prevent water treatment plants also from being attacked, et cetera. But also in the additive manufacturing space. So we are developing various techniques to attack and secure additive manufacturing. We haven't seen any real threats in a while, but we've introduced threats, where in this sort of 4D space, meaning that you can print out an object, and there's this fourth dimension is this external excitation, maybe it's temperature, humidity, or whatever it is. But that object can actually change shape, so imagine a propeller that's printed out and then at a certain temperature, one of the blades change by a few degrees, right? So this is actually a physical logic bomb that's actually embedded in the 3D printed object. So my students are doing really super, super cool work. And I'll say that that's my favorite thing that we're working on these days.
So I think I'll go last. So I would just love to say, first and foremost, there is so much excellent and cool and very important research happening at Georgia Tech in the cybersecurity space, which I think is just what makes this place so awesome. And so I have to say it's all cool and it's all interesting for various aspects. But personally speaking, I'm a big fan of putting bad guys behind bars, so I have a personal affinity for the attribution work that's going on here.
Thank you, everyone. So on that note, being Halloween just around the corner, what is your cybersecurity nightmare?
Renita has one that she was telling me about.
Yeah, I do. You want me to go first, Shelby?
No, I think it's a great one.
My cybersecurity nightmare is having our infrastructure attacked or compromised. And in class actually yesterday, Shelby is talking about a case study that we present on Stuxnet. And so it's, this malware that was designed to sabotage one of Iran's nuclear facilities. And it terrifies me to think about that could happen here. This happened 10 years ago, so and things have even become more sophisticated. But we have wonderful people like those that I work with across GTRI and Georgia Tech that are working on preventative measures to keep those things from happening here. So, but that's pretty scary for me.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I work on the stuff that terrifies me in critical infrastructure. So if, an attacker and, these devices are legacy devices and many are insecure, and patching is irregular. And so just, if our critical infrastructure is actually compromised and is acted on, again, we've seen attackers get into our critical infrastructure, but you can do so much damage with, modifying the code on the PLC, for example, programmable logic controller that could, cause dams to open and, cause more chlorine to put in the water and all these other just really, really scary attacks that are very possible. So anything that's critical infrastructure related, to me, it worries me.
I'll beat the policy drum one more time. I think in taking into account what Raheem and Jimmy said on it, I think that my biggest cybersecurity nightmare is that if there, are political forces beyond industry control that makes the job harder for us, whether through well-intended or unintended consequences of those policies. Things like that, especially with how agile Congress usually is not, something like that could set us back decades.
So I have two of them. So I think on a national and global perspective, my nightmare is just the erosion of our political systems and our, the very structures and foundations that support societies through cyber attacks, right? So, and we see that more and more frequently now. And just so, a devolving of our systems that keep us all, plugging along and happy and healthy. That's a big concern for me. And on a much more personal level, my biggest nightmare is budget cuts.
Thank you. I think that's everyone. And I guess that concludes our discussion for today. I want to say from Rolanda and I, thank you all for joining us today and for this insightful discussion on how to create cybersecurity culture. And thank you to the panelists for sharing their expertise and experience in the subject matter. If you would like to find out a bit more about Georgia Tech's cybersecurity programs, please visit omscybersecurity.govtech.edu for information about our online masters in cybersecurity and p.govtech.edu/cyber-live for details about our cybersecurity certificate and courses. You can also see the details on your screen, and you can find the links in the comments section of the session. We'd love to keep in touch, and there were a few really good questions from the audience that we couldn't get to today, so we'll try to answer these on social media. So please follow us on Facebook and Twitter at GTOMS. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists and to everyone. Enjoy the remainder of this Cyber Security Awareness Month. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yes, thank you.